Comparative advantage theory of trade. Comparative advantage theory of trade is called the classical theory of trade. This theory was put forward by the famous classical economist David Ricardo in 1815, just after the introduction of absolute advantage theory of trade by Adam Smith, another classical economist. As I said, this is the theory of classical trade, and this is called the theory of comparative cost, and I will explain why this theory is called the theory of comparative cost later. So why does this theory was introduced? So this theory was introduced to correct the deficiencies of absolute advantage theory. And what was the deficiency of absolute advantage theory in the trade, international trade scenario? So absolute advantage theory, according to the absolute advantage theory, only the nations with absolute advantage can export. The nations with absolute disadvantage cannot be engaged in exporting the commodities. So this deficiency was corrected by David Ricardo's theory of comparative cost. This is so important, as there are some situations in which some nations cannot gain absolute advantage. So what does the comparative advantage theory say? So this theory explains the basis of international trade. So this theory explains how does international trade takes place between two nations. This is the basis on which international trade will takes place. So as per the theory, country with comparative advantage can export, country with comparative disadvantage can import the commodity from the other nation. So there are situations in which there will be some comparative advantage for some nations on some commodities, and there may be some comparative disadvantage for some countries on some commodities. So international trade will take place only when the nation has got the comparative advantage on the particular commodity, and if a nation doesn't have any comparative advantage on a particular commodity, that commodity will be imported from the nation which has got the comparative advantage on the commodity. So that means international trade will be governed by comparative differences in cost. And let me explain the differences in cost and how does the difference in cost will lead to international trade between two nations. So let us explain the same by using this example. You can see there are two nations. This is in fact a two nation, two commodity, one factor model, 2 into 2 into 1 model. That means there are only two nations, and in our example we have only England and Portugal, and we have only two commodities, wine and cloth, and we have only one factor of production, that is labor. So in the example, in the table given in the slide, you can see England needs to produce 1 unit of wine by using 120 hours of labor. So the same commodity, same unit of wine, 1 unit of wine in Portugal will be produced only with 80 hours of labor. That means Portugal has got the absolute advantage on the production of wine. And coming to the last column of the table, so for producing 1 unit of cloth, England require 100 labor hours, while Portugal need only 90 hours of labor. So in both cases, for producing both wine and cloth, Portugal has got the absolute advantage for producing both wine and cloth. So if international trade is taking place on the basis of Adam Smith's absolute advantage theory, only Portugal can export. Only Portugal can dominate the international trade with exporting both wine and cloth to England. So England cannot export if absolute advantage theory is being followed. So let's have to consider the possibility of comparative cost advantage theory as argued by David Ricardo. So here we have to check out the cost ratios of wine and cloth in case of both Portugal and England. Let's look first in the Portugal's case for producing both wine and cloth. So for producing wine, the cost ratio of Portugal is 80 labor hours, that is a labor hours required to produce 1 unit of wine in Portugal. So 80 by 120, 120 is a 120 hours of labor to produce 1 unit of wine in England. So compared to England, cost ratio of Portugal for producing wine is 0.66. It is less than the cost ratio of producing cloth. So cloth's cost ratio is 90 by 100, that is 0.9. 90 is the labor hours required to produce 1 unit of cloth in Portugal, divided by 100. 100 is the labor hours required to produce 1 unit of cloth in England. So that is 0.9. So Portugal has got the lowest cost ratio in on producing wine. So similarly, let's look at the second column of the table, that is England's case. So in England, for producing wine, cost ratio is much higher, that is 1.5. That means 120 by 80. 120 is the labor hours required to produce 1 unit of wine in England, and divided by 80. 80 is the labor hours to required to be produced in Portugal. So it is greater than 100 by 90. 100 is the labor hours required to produce 1 unit of cloth in England, divided by 90. 90 is the labor hours required to produce 1 unit of cloth in Portugal. So 100 by 90 is 1.11. That means cost ratio of England for producing wine is greater than that of cloth. So Portugal has lowest cost ratio for wine, and England has the lowest cost ratio for cloth. So here, this is the case before the specialization, and after the specialization, what will happen? All laborers available in the nation will be specialized in producing either commodity, any one of the commodity. So in Portugal, since wine has Portugal has the lowest cost ratio on wine, so all producers will be engaged in producing wine, so they can maximize their profit, they can maximize their production, and so they can gain from international trade if comparative advantage is being followed. So take the case of England as well. So England, if after the specialization, all laborers who are employed in the sector industry will be specializing in the production of cloth only. So no extra cost will be required to produce wine. So they have better situation in case of cloth. So all laborers will be engaged in cloth production, so they can maximize the gain from producing cloth. So they can also gain from trade. Portugal can also gain from trade if specialization is possible. So maximization of benefit will be possible only after the international trade on the basis of comparative advantage cost differences, even if the absolute cost differences is only for Portugal, but comparative cost differences are available for both nations, Portugal and England. So this trade model will be valid only when these assumptions are in practice. And this theory is valid only when there are only two nations, two commodities, and one factor. So that is 2 into 2 into 1 model. And another assumption is labor is the only productive factor. There are no other factors of production like capital. So capital's role has been ignored completely by the classical theory, both classical theories of trade. So labor is the only productive factor according to the theorist. And cost of production is just measured in wage, only measured in wage. There are no other cost of production. Transportation cost has been ignored, maintenance cost has been ignored, and capital's cost, and there is no capital according to them, and so there is no cost of capital as well. And labor is perfectly mobile only within the nation, and labor is not mobile across the borders. Laborers cannot be expatriated for laborers cannot be migrated to another nation for engage in the employment sector. So labor is immobile across the nation, and it is homogeneous as well, and that means productivity is same for all laborers in a nation. So this is another assumption of classical theory of trade. And another assumption is free trade. There is no restriction on trade, and if there are a restriction on trade, and comparative advantage theory will not perfectly operate. And another assumption is constant returns to scale for producing both commodities in both nation, and no increasing return, no diminishing return. So this is in practice throughout the production stages in both nations, and all factors are employed. There is no factor there is no laborer in fact remains unemployed. That means every laborer in the nation will be engaged in the production of either commodity after specialization, and even before specialization will be engaged in producing both commodities. And perfect competition is the another assumption. And if there is no perfect competition, that means no consumer, no government, no individual, no firm is able to influence the price. The price is only influenced by the cost of production, which is the wage only. So in short, absolute advantage theory is governed by, as per the absolute advantage theory, trade is governed by absolute advantage or absolute differences in cost. Similarly, at the same time, comparative advantage theory states that international trade is governed by comparative differences in cost. That is comparative advantage. Similarly, as per the absolute advantage theory, all nations may not get a chance for export, because there are situations in which some nations don't have the absolute advantage. At the same time, only some nations will get the absolute advantage. So this deficiency can be corrected by comparative advantage theory of trade. So as per the comparative advantage theory, all nations will get a chance for export, since there will be some comparative advantage after the specialization of the labor force in the nation on any of the commodity.